Hi, I'm Dr. Jennifer Maloy from the Department of Academic Literacy, and I'm here today talking with Dr. Mark Van Ells from the History Department, and he's going to be answering some questions about Cambodian history and culture in preparation for our common read, The Road of Lost Innocence by Somaly Mam, and the common read events are going to begin on March 17th. So, hello.
Hi. Good to be here.
Thank you for answering some of our questions.
My pleasure.
So I basically took some parts of the book, some quotes from the book, and thought that I would maybe read a couple to you and then ask you some questions about the history of Cambodia and also how you see Cambodian history and culture affecting Somaly Mam's life. So Mom begins her book by introducing herself and giving her readers a historic and cultural context for her life story. And on pages 2 and 3, she says, "I was born sometime around 1970 or 1971 when the troubles began in Cambodia. My parents left me with my maternal grandmother when I was still a small child. Perhaps they were seeking a better life, or perhaps they were forced to leave. Before I turned 5, the country had been carpet bombed by the Americans. Then it was seized by the murderous regime of Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge." So what are the troubles that she describes in Cambodia?
Well, what's going on is that next door in Vietnam, there's a very nasty civil war in which the Americans are involved. The communists controlled the northern part of Vietnam, and the American-backed government was in South Vietnam. Now, the problem for Cambodia was North Vietnam was bringing supplies into South Vietnam along something called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through dense jungle, mountainous areas that spilled over into the countries of Laos and Cambodia. So basically the communists in North Vietnam were using Cambodia as a base through which to bring supplies into South Vietnam. So that's what got the Americans involved. President Nixon begins bombing secretly in Cambodia in 1969 to try and interdict those supplies. And then in 1970, the United States and South Vietnam actually invades a portion of Cambodia to try to stop these supplies from getting into South Vietnam. And that, of course, caused a great deal of dislocation among rural Cambodians themselves. So those are the troubles that she's referring to.
And what is the Khmer Rouge?
The Khmer Rouge was a radical Cambodian communist faction. The North Vietnamese were communists, but the Khmer Rouge had a somewhat different view of a communist utopia than the North Vietnamese did. Pol Pot was the leader of the Cambodian communists, and he envisioned a kind of completely agrarian society where cities would be emptied out and things would go back to basics. They actually called it Year Zero, and they would simply completely restart Cambodian history from that point, which meant a complete and total dislocation of Cambodian society.
And so what were some of the specific things that Pol Pot envisioned for Cambodia?
Well, with his rural utopia, he wanted to purge Cambodian society of all sort of outside influences, which would include, ethnic groups within Cambodia, like there were some Vietnamese and Laotians and various ethnic minorities in Cambodia. But he was really concerned about getting Western influence out of Cambodia. So, for example, anyone who had a Western education, Western friends, any sort of connections to the modern world. I mean, it got so ridiculous that even people with glasses were targeted, but with the idea that they were somehow more educated and polluted with impure ideas. That these were people who were really targeted for liquidation, I guess you could say.
And when did the end of, or the fall of the Khmer Rouge take place?
Well, that happened when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia. So that simply replaced the radical Pol Pot Khmer Rouge communism with what you might call the more standard communism of the North Vietnamese. They invaded and kicked the Khmer Rouge out. So that's when the world began to really appreciate the horrors of the Pol Pot regime.
And what were some of the consequences of the rule of the Khmer Rouge? What were the effects on Cambodian society?
Yeah, well, again, starting from year one, simply uprooting your whole trained class of bureaucrats, technicians, people with know-how, knowledge about the modern world. Just think about how to restart all your technology, how to restart your government, law enforcement. I mean, they really ripped up the whole society, root and branch. So basically everything was affected.
How do you think the rule of the Khmer Rouge influenced Somaly Mam's life?
Well, she writes that it didn't seem to have that much of an impact on her. Now, she was in a really remote area. She lived in a very agrarian ethnic community. So she didn't seem to have that much, and she was very young at the time Pol Pot was in power as well. The main effect seemed to be what happened after the Vietnamese enter and as she comes more of age.
Okay. And then a lot of people talk about the genocide that took place in Cambodia. So could you maybe define what a genocide is and then tell us a little bit about what happened during the Cambodian genocide?
Sure. Well, as I explained before, I think, a genocide is simply when a specific ethnic group, religious group, some sort of group in society is specifically targeted for liquidation, to simply be killed off. The most famous example, of course, is the Holocaust of World War II, but there have been plenty of other examples where people of various ethnic groups, religions, classes, what have you, have been attacked with the intention of simply getting rid of them altogether. The Cambodian genocide, again, is trying to rid the country of Western influence, religious influences, religious groups, Muslim Chams, for example, Buddhist priests, and these sorts of things, and simply trying to wipe out all these foreign influences and modern influences, which targeted, it wasn't specifically as specific as, let's say, targeting Jews in the Holocaust, but it's simply trying to wipe certain groups of people off the map. It's a genocide.
Okay, thank you. And then, so you mentioned that in the early 80s, the
Vietnamese come in, right?
Yes, the Vietnamese came in, and then there was a change from the Khmer Rouge to a communist government.
A different kind of communist government.
A different kind. Yeah. So could you maybe explain what life was like in Vietnamese communist Cambodia?
Well, it would be more like what you would find, say, in the Soviet Union. The Vietnamese communists were allied with the Soviets, so it would be more along the lines of what you might expect as a more standard communist Marxist state. Collective ownership of land, oftentimes factories and those sorts of things. But also she talks a lot about education. She actually credits the communist regime with providing education that she might not otherwise have gotten. So those sorts of things were also part of the communist system.
Yeah, and actually I chose a quote from the end of chapter 2 on page 28, where she talks about her life under communism, saying, "I look back now at those days and I think communism was the best system for Cambodia. School was free and it gave children a way out of poverty, not like today when parents must pay huge sums of money for education and every diploma can be bought for a price. Hospitals were few and poorly equipped then, but they were practically free. Nowadays you could be dying, but if you can't pay, they won't look at you." So how long did this communist government last, and then what replaced it? Because Mom talks about how communism was very different from what's in place now in Cambodia.
Well, the situation in Cambodia was very tied to the rest of the Cold War. And even within the communist world, there were rivalries between the Soviets and the Chinese in particular. So there are many different kinds of communism. When the Cold War ends, basically the Vietnamese want to pull out of Cambodia. They've got their own problems to deal with. The Soviet Union's, their main benefactor, is collapsing. So they want to leave Cambodia. They've got their own problems to deal with. So that's, when the UN gets involved, and that's when the peacekeepers and the aid societies and things like that come in. I mean, with the end of the Cold War, that pretty much ends the communist occupation of Cambodia too.
Okay. And in chapter 6, Mom describes the increase of French and Italian and English people in Cambodia. She says that began to happen around 19 '89 when the Vietnamese soldiers were leaving. What did the Western Europeans want to accomplish in Cambodia?
Well, a number of things. Many people were genuinely touched by the scale of the Cambodian genocide, genuinely wanted to help rebuild that society. Certainly others saw the opportunity for investment. You know, the communist system is gone, so now it's a place for cheap labor, frankly. Things like that. So people had various motivations for wanting to open the country. Certainly it's a very beautiful country. It's very historically very interesting. You know, tourism could help to build up the economy. So there are various motivations for doing that.
And what do you think some of the benefits were of the presence of Western Europeans, and also maybe what were some of the negative consequences?
Well, that's a big philosophical question, really. Certainly in Somaly's case, she notes how Westerners treated her differently, how they seemed to bring certain energy to society. Some would say economic exploitation, perhaps. Western men are still using prostitution and those sorts of things. But it did seem to bring a certain vitality to the country, more connection with the outside world and the rest of the world, which, you know, certainly in her case, that sort of outside attention is going to be very good to shining a light on the prostitution problem in that country. So it'd be a mixed bag. You can see some disadvantages like exploitation, but some good things from it as well.
Okay, and then at the end of her book, she reflects a lot on the state of Cambodia and how history may have affected current Cambodian culture and also some of the problems that Cambodia faces. And on page 184, she says, how did Cambodia get to be this way? 3 decades of bombing, genocide, and starvation, and now my country is in a state of moral bankruptcy. She then goes on to say, more than half the people in Cambodia today were born after the fall of the Khmer Rouge. Things should be improving, but the country is in a state of chaos where the only rule is every man for himself. So, I mean, what is Cambodia like today, and why do you think Mom might characterize Cambodia in this way?
Yeah, well, I've never been there, so I'd love to go. Maybe someday. I can't really comment on, you know, any personal experience of what it's like now. I think you can argue that it's improving. What was the other part of your question? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just wondering, you know, either why do you think she has this description of Cambodia, or maybe you could just comment on some of the strengths and the room for improvement in Cambodia.
Well, the Pol Pot regime has been gone for a number of years. Now, he hid out in the jungle for a long time, and he's now dead. But the Khmer Rouge was still a factor in Cambodia for a long time. I think it gets back to how you completely rip up an entire society and start from scratch. How do you put it all back together again? And, you know, even though half of the population wasn't even alive at the time, the sort of chaos in the wake of the Cambodian genocide, that can get ingrained into the culture. It's really hard to repair the damage that's caused by that, even over subsequent generations. You know, for example, in this country, there was slavery for a long time, and slavery was done away with the racism that just seemed to justify slavery, that was used to justify slavery. That still is part of our society, sadly, still today. So the echoes of this will reverberate down through generations, and sadly, it might take a long time to really move completely past the Pol Pot era and really heal the wounds of that society.
I also had some more general questions about Cambodian culture. Mom describes herself as being half Phnom and half Khmer, and this really affects her in many ways growing up and also as an adult. Could you explain what these categories mean for Cambodians?
Sure. Southeast Asia is a remarkably interesting place where you've literally got dozens and maybe even hundreds of different ethnic groups all across the region. So there are the main countries, Cambodia, you've got the Khmers who are the dominant group, and Vietnam, you've got the Vietnamese, but it's scattered across the mountains and valleys all across the region are a number of different ethnic groups. The Phnom are just one of them. If you look at the American experience in the Vietnam War, for example, there's a group in Laos and Vietnam called the Hmong, H-M-O-N-G, and the U.S. CIA actually worked with them, and they ended up, the communists won that war, and many of them ended up coming to the United States. There was that Clint Eastwood movie, Gran Torino. The family that moves next door to him, they're Hmong. They're one of these many different ethnic groups that are found across the hills and valleys of Southeast Asia. And there are oftentimes the people who live in the highlands have animosities towards the people in the lowlands. The people in the lowlands tend to view the people in the highlands as being savages. She uses that term savage all the time. They see the lowland people as being aggressive and wanting to take them over. So there's a lot of tension between these different groups, different religious groups. So it's really a patchwork of many different kinds of people, different ethnic backgrounds, languages, racial heritages, backgrounds, these sorts of things. It's a big patchwork.
And you mentioned religion. Could you tell us a little bit about the different religions that exist within Cambodian culture?
Sure. Well, predominantly it's a Buddhist society. Going back to ancient times, Hinduism had predominated there. Due to French colonialism and perhaps modern Western influence, you've got a small number of Christians who are there. There are Muslim groups across the region, the Chams, for example. So there's various Muslim groups across Southeast Asia. So it's Buddhism, and of course with more traditional groups in the highlands, you can find more traditional animist kinds of religions. So it's a mix, but Buddhism being sort of predominant. I'll also say in Southeast Asian cultures, there's oftentimes a tendency to mix different religious traditions, syncretism it's called, so people can actually follow different practices and different beliefs from different religions, which might seem strange from a sort of a Judeo-Christian Muslim perspective, but it's actually not uncommon across Asia to sort of pick and choose different aspects of different faiths.
Okay, and the other question I had was whether you could speak at all about about gender roles in Cambodian society, because Mom talks a lot about the sort of traditional gender divisions and how that influenced her life, but also the problem that she tries to deal with.
Well, I think across Asia there's historically been a male-dominated society where women are supposed to be sort of in the background and not speak up and be submissive, and that sort of thing I'm sure is more pronounced with more traditional societies. Western societies are also more individualistic. In America, it's expected that you look someone in the eye and you shake their hand and those sorts of things. And those sorts of relationships are viewed sort of as rudely in many Asian societies. So, so for a woman to speak up, and she had a lot of guts to do. She has a lot of guts to do what she does, because it does go against sort of the traditional gender stereotype, gendered roles, and other traditional roles in Asian societies.
Okay, thank you. What's one thing that you learned from reading The Road of Lost Innocence?
I guess I didn't realize just how pervasive the prostitution problem was. I mean, I was aware it existed. There's sex tourism that goes on in many parts of the world, including Southeast Asia. I guess I didn't appreciate how broad it was, how young the girls were. I think I get a better appreciation of the depth of the problem.
And is there anything that Somaly Mam says in her book that you disagree with or that raises questions, maybe in particular to either Cambodian history or Cambodian society?
No, I wouldn't want to argue with her. I don't think all men are bad. I've got two daughters, The book really it affected me. It was really a very interesting, hard to read book, but very interesting to read. I'm not going to quibble whether I can see where she comes to those conclusions, but we're not all bad. I guess that's my only criticism, really.
Okay. And then is there anything else that you'd like to say, either about Cambodian history or about the book in general?
Not specifically. I hope Cambodia continues to mend, and I hope the cause she's fighting for will eventually be won. That's about it. Okay. It's a really interesting book. I'm really glad I read it.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure.